My daughter raised her glass and smiled. She said her mother-in-law owned 4 restaurants in Texas. Then she looked at me and added, "My mom still scrubs airport toilets at midnight." I stood there holding a paper bag of cookies. No one laughed out loud, but no one stopped her either. That was the moment I knew I had disappeared from my own family. But what they didn't know was I had already decided that night to disappear on my own terms. It was 3:47 in the morning when the mop handle snapped in my hands. I didn't flinch, just stared at the jagged edge for a second, then leaned it carefully against the wall. My knees were already aching from the cold tile floor. I had 3 more stalls to go, and the cleaning crew for the early flights wouldn't show up for another hour. That night, like most, I had been assigned the lower terminal restrooms at the Midland Airport. Quiet section, less traffic, and the only one without a working heater. The smell of bleach had already soaked into my coat, and I could feel the sweat drying between my shoulder blades. Somewhere in my locker was a photo of my daughter when she was 9, holding up a spelling bee ribbon, teeth missing, socks rolled down unevenly. That photo used to sit on my desk when I was still doing payroll for Mitex Oil. Before I gave up the numbers, before I gave up weekends, before I became the backup janitor who sleeps in a converted utility closet between shifts. I wasn't supposed to be on my feet past midnight. The doctor said so after the second round of blood pressure spikes. But what do you do when the retirement check doesn't even cover rent and your daughter says, "Mom, just stay busy. It's good for your spirit." My spirit? The only thing keeping me upright at that hour was the thought of tomorrow. I'd found a small secondhand bakery cookbook in the lost and found bin last week. I planned to try one of the cookie recipes for my granddaughter. Just a small paper bag of cookies. She loves chocolate chip. They invited me for Christmas Eve dinner. That was something. I told myself that was something. No one told me what to wear or whether I'd have a seat at the table, but I decided I'd go anyway. I folded the last paper towel triangle and placed it exactly in the center of the sink. A habit. When everything else in life feels unstable, symmetry matters. I slipped off the gloves, rinsed my hands slowly in the cold faucet water. The mirror above the sink was cracked at the corner, but I could still see my face, the tired folds around my mouth, the gray creeping farther down my hairline, the small scar from when Sienna was 2 and kicked her plastic pony into my eyebrow. Funny how some scars outlive the love that caused them. By the time I locked the supply closet and stepped out into the parking lot, the sun was just barely pushing through the clouds. Christmas Eve. My breath fogged in the air, but I didn't feel cold. There's a kind of warmth that only comes from hope, not the loud, glittery kind, the quiet kind, like a woman carrying cookies in a paper bag, holding on to a small, flickering maybe. I wonder if you've ever stood at that edge, too, between believing you still matter and slowly realizing you've been invisible for a long time. That's where I was just before it all shifted. I arrived at Sienna's house at 5:12 that evening. Not late, not early. The sun was already sinking behind the oak trees lining her street, the kind of quiet suburban road where all the driveways curved the same and the windows glowed gold from the inside. I parked 2 houses down. I didn't want to block her guests or draw attention. I had changed in the airport restroom before leaving. Navy pants, white cardigan, the pearl clip I hadn't worn in years. My hands still smelled faintly of bleach. The bag of cookies sat beside me on the passenger seat, folded neatly. I had tied a red ribbon around the top. It wasn't much, but it was something I made with my hands, and I wanted to believe that still meant something. When I rang the doorbell, I heard laughter from inside. Then the door swung open. It was Marshall. He looked surprised for a second, then did that tight-lipped nod men like him do when they don't want to make a scene. He stepped aside without saying anything. Inside, it smelled like rosemary and roasted garlic. Jazz music played low in the background. The dining table was already set with 12 seats, white linen, name cards, champagne flutes. I stood by the door, clutching the paper bag. No one came to take my coat. Sienna appeared from the kitchen, dressed in a silk blouse the color of pomegranate. Her hair was pinned up like the local news anchors wear. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. "You made it," she said flatly, glancing over my shoulder like she expected someone else behind me. Then she turned to adjust a serving tray. I followed her into the kitchen. I tried to offer the cookies. She barely glanced at the bag and said she had already ordered dessert from a French patisserie. I asked if there was a spot I could help set up. She told me not to worry. Everything had been taken care of, so I drifted. I moved to the hallway near the living room, watching the guests arrive. Most were Marshall's colleagues, men in crisp blazers and women with polished smiles. They toasted with expensive wine and talked about real estate and IPOs. No one noticed the older woman standing near the coat rack. Eventually, I found an empty chair near the far end of the living room. It wasn't at the dining table. It faced away from it, tucked near the window beside a decorative plant. I sat there quietly, listening to the clinking of silverware being arranged. Dinner started at 6. Sienna never called me over. I waited, thinking maybe there had been a mistake, but one by one, the chairs at the table filled. My name was not on any card. My place was not among them. Then came the toast. Marshall stood up, glass in hand. He thanked everyone for coming, praised Sienna's efforts, and made a joke about their upcoming expansion plans with her mother-in-law's 4th restaurant opening in Austin. That was when Sienna chimed in loud enough for the room, but still with that practiced, breezy voice she used for dinner parties. "My mother-in-law is a powerhouse," she said, smiling. "For restaurants and counting. And my own mom is still scrubbing airport toilets at midnight." A few people chuckled. Not a true laugh, just the kind of laugh you give when you're not sure if it's supposed to be a joke. No one looked in my direction. No one corrected her. I didn't stand up. I didn't speak. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, while the taste of rosemary floated through the air like nothing had just cracked open. At 6:42, I rose quietly. I left the paper bag of cookies on a side table near the coats. I slipped on my shoes and walked out the front door. Nobody followed. I walked back to the airport that night, not because I had a shift. I had taken the night off, but I didn't want to go home. Not yet. The sidewalk was damp, and the cold had settled into my knees. I didn't bother wiping my shoes when I reached the staff entrance. The guard recognized me and buzzed me through without a word. He didn't ask why I was there. Maybe he saw it in my face. I didn't go to the break room or the lockers. I went straight to the restroom I usually cleaned, the one at the far end of Terminal B, where the heater had been broken for years. I stood inside for a moment. Everything was spotless, just like I had left it the day before. There was something about that quiet space, about the hum of the fluorescent light above the mirror, and the way the tile floor echoed the smallest shift of your feet. It wasn't comforting exactly, but it was familiar and it was honest. I walked over to the sink, reached for the paper towel roll, pulled one sheet, folded it slowly into a triangle, and placed it at the center of the counter, perfectly aligned. Then I pulled out my old notebook from my coat pocket. I had started keeping it after Harold died. Just a thin spiral one, cover peeling at the corners. I opened it to the first empty page, wrote the date, then paused. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote the next line, December 24th. I was erased today, not from the dinner, not from the room, but from my own family. I stared at that sentence, letting it sit there in the quiet. I don't know how long I stood in that bathroom, but when I finally left, my breath fogged again in the cold air. The streets were empty. Christmas lights blinked gently in the distance, mocking the silence around me. When I reached the back lot where the staff parked, I noticed a voicemail on my phone. It was from Lorraine. She used to run a small diner near the edge of town. We had crossed paths years ago when I worked for Midtex Oil. She was always the kind of woman who kept her own books, knew every supplier by name, and never took nonsense from anyone. Her message was short. "Hey, Eloise, I'm getting ready to sell the diner. Thought of you. You ever think about going back to something that's yours, not borrowed, not owed, yours? Call me if you do." I didn't call her back. Not right away, but I saved the message. I played it again when I got home. Home. That was a generous word for the storage closet I had been sleeping in. There was no bed, just a cot, a space heater, and a curtain rod I used to hang my coat. I changed into my flannel pajamas, sat on the edge of the cot, and opened my banking app. Not the checking account. The other one, the one linked to the company stock options I had earned years ago before I left Midtex. Most months I ignored it, pretended it didn't exist. But tonight, I opened it, watched the numbers load. The total stared back at me, $312,427. No one knew I had it, not even Sienna. I closed the app, then reached for the notebook again, turned to a fresh page. I don't think I cried, not because I wasn't sad, but because what I felt was too quiet for tears. It was the kind of sadness that just settles in your chest like a new tenant. You don't fight it. You just give it a corner and let it unpack. I turned off the lamp, lay down on the cot, and whispered into the dark. You're still here. You still matter, but not to them. Not anymore. Lorraine's message echoed in my head for 2 days before I finally picked up the phone. I called her on my lunch break, sitting in the farthest corner of the break room with my back to the vending machine. My voice felt scratchy when I said hello, like it hadn't been used properly in a while. She answered on the second ring. Said she was surprised I called, but not too surprised. Said she had a feeling I might. Lorraine always had a way of reading under the surface without making you feel exposed. We agreed to meet that Sunday. Her diner, the Round Window, was already closed for good, but she still had the keys. She said I could stop by, take a look, and just walk the space. The day I went, the sky was gray and heavy. The kind of cold that settled in your bones and made your teeth ache if you stood still too long. I wore my old denim jacket and brought a thermos of tea. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was to keep my hands from shaking. The diner sat at the edge of an old service road, surrounded by warehouses and chain-link fences. The paint on the sign had faded to a dull rust red, and one of the neon letters no longer lit up, but the windows were still clean. Lorraine never left anything dirty. Inside, it smelled like thyme, like grease that had soaked into the counters and sugar that had seeped into the floorboards. The booths were worn. Corners split where years of elbows had leaned and lovers had whispered. The coffee station was still there, untouched. A calendar from last June hung behind it, curling at the edges. Lorraine let me wander. She didn't say much. Just walked behind the counter and made herself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. I ran my fingers along the edge of a table, sat in the corner booth beneath the vent that always rattled in the summer. I could still picture Harold sitting across from me holding a newspaper he never really read. I used to bring Sienna here on weekends when she was little. We'd share a stack of pancakes and draw with crayons on the napkins. Back then, she used to beg me to open a place of my own. Said I made the best pies, better than anything sold in a box. But life doesn't always leave room for dreams like that. Lorraine sat down across from me, looked me straight in the eye, and asked if I still remembered how to bake. I nodded once. She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a copy of the business license, a deed to the property, and a note written in her slanted, matter-of-fact handwriting. It said, "I'm giving you first right. I'd rather it be yours than gutted into another vape shop. You've got 2 weeks. After that, it goes public." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I just sat there, the paper in my hands, heart thudding louder than the heater kicking on behind us. Later that night, I reopened the notebook, the one with the peeling cover. I wrote down 3 words. Maybe it's time. Then I turned to the back, tore out a clean sheet, and began sketching something I hadn't dared to imagine in decades. A new layout, a new name, one that had nothing to do with being someone's mother. One that didn't need permission. I didn't tell Sienna. Not yet. Some things you have to build in the quiet before the world starts weighing in. Some things need to grow in the dark where no one's watching, where it's just you and the spark. I spent the next 10 days moving in silence. No announcements, no big plans shared with anyone, just small, deliberate steps. Each morning before my shift, I'd stop by the diner with a notebook tucked under my arm. The sun hadn't risen yet, and frost clung to the glass windows like lace. I'd unlock the door, flick on a single overhead light, and sit in the booth closest to the kitchen with a cup of gas station coffee. That booth had the best view of the whole space. From there, I could see the flow: tables, counters, entrance, exit. I started sketching layouts, not just where to put the coffee station or how many seats to keep. I was thinking about the women I'd seen cleaning the terminals with me. The ones who came in early, left late, heads down, backs stiff. I kept thinking about the airport janitor who used to hum gospel songs as she mopped, about the overnight shuttle driver with swollen ankles who once gave me half her sandwich without saying a word. I wasn't building a business. I was building a place for women like us. I decided to call it No Apologies. A place where no one had to explain why they were tired, why their hands were cracked, why their dreams had taken a back seat for 30 years. By the end of that week, I had a working plan, basic budget, layout, and supply list. I reopened the brokerage app and transferred $120,000 into a new account. I flagged it Startup Capital. I didn't flinch. That money had sat untouched for years, but it was mine, earned before I ever became just Sienna's mom. The first person I told was Lorraine. I caught her by surprise. She tried to act casual, sipping her coffee like always, but her mouth twitched at the corners when I said the name. She handed me a ring of keys and said she'd already called her cousin about the permits. Told me to expect a call by Monday. I worked my shifts like usual, mopped the same floors, refilled the same soap dispensers, but now I walked a little taller, moved with something inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time. Some nights I would catch my reflection in the mirrored paper towel dispensers. I looked older, sure, more worn, but I also looked real, not invisible, not someone's burden. One afternoon, finishing my shift, I stopped by a supply store near the freeway. I picked up paint samples: soft olive green, warm cream, a dusty rose that reminded me of an old apron I used to wear when baking pies. I spread the samples across the diner counter that night, hands trembling slightly. Not from nerves, from something else. Something like beginning. On day 10, I finally told someone else, Maribel. She was one of the night shift janitors at the airport. We weren't close, but we shared a kind of quiet respect. She was meticulous, fast, and didn't waste time with small talk. I caught her during her break sitting near the vending machines. I asked if she ever thought about quitting, about doing something different. She looked at me, tired but curious. I told her about No Apologies for what I wanted to build. A small place, a real place. No uniforms, no quotas, just coffee, conversation, and room to breathe. She didn't say much, just nodded slowly, then asked what kind of hours I was thinking. That night, I wrote her name at the top of my notebook page. First hire. The next day, she handed me a worn recipe card. She said it was her grandmother's empanadas and that she hadn't cooked them in years. I tucked it into my notebook. Everything was still quiet. No one outside that small circle knew what I was building. But something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't surviving. I was building. The first morning of paint was the coldest of the month. The heat inside the diner still hadn't been fixed, so I wore 2 sweaters under my jacket. Lorraine stopped by with muffins and a folding space heater that hummed louder than a lawnmower. Maribel showed up at 7 sharp, her hair tied back, sleeves already rolled. She didn't ask what to do, just grabbed a brush and got to work on the back wall. We painted over the pale yellow with warm cream. It soaked into the walls like the room had been waiting for it. By noon, the diner no longer felt like something left over. It felt like a beginning. I didn't say much, but my hands wouldn't stop moving, wiping edges, straightening baseboards, sweeping dried flakes from the floor. Lorraine took charge of the paperwork. She had always been good at that. I watched her speak to the city clerk with a voice so firm they barely asked follow-up questions. She handed me a folder 3 days later. Inside were the updated licenses, permits, and the official transfer of ownership. It had my name on it. For the first time in decades, something belonged to me again. We worked in quiet rhythm over the next 2 weeks. I ordered new signage, kept the original shape of the round diner window, but had the words "No Apologies" hand-painted across the glass. I bought a used espresso machine from a closing bakery and found a scratched pastry case listed online for $50. Lorraine's brother drove it down in his pickup. We paid him in chili and cornbread. One afternoon, as I was scrubbing the grout behind the kitchen sink, I heard the doorbell chime. It wasn't delivery. I wiped my hands and peeked around the corner. It was Sienna. She stood in the doorway with a shopping bag and a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her heels clicked against the tile as she stepped inside. Her voice carried the same practiced charm I'd seen at her dinner table. She glanced around the room like it was a stage set, not a living thing. She asked what I was doing here. I told her it was mine. She blinked once, said she didn't realize I had that kind of money. Then she looked at the menu board we taped to the wall and asked if this was really how I wanted to spend my retirement. I told her I didn't plan on retiring. I planned on living. There was silence after that, just the low hum of the heater. Then she reached into her bag and handed me a tin of holiday cookies bought from a boutique shop, still sealed. I thanked her. She said she had to get to a yoga class and left. I stood there for a long time after the door shut, the tin still in my hands. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just breathed deep and slow. That night, Marble and I finished painting the kitchen trim. I opened the tin and set the cookies out for anyone who wanted one. We both laughed at how dry they were. Maribel said her empanadas would blow them out of the water. I told her I believed her. When we locked up, the lights from the street reflected off the new sign in the window. No apologies. The letters looked bold, but not loud. Strong, but not aggressive. Just enough. It felt right, like I was finally standing in a life that wasn't borrowed or tolerated or just barely endured. It was mine. We opened on a Thursday morning. No balloons, no banners, just the smell of cinnamon scones and strong coffee drifting into the street as the sun peeled back the gray. Marble came in early, with her grandmother's empanadas still warm in a paper bag. Lorraine handled the register and brewed coffee like she'd never left. At 6:47 a.m., the first customer walked in. An older woman with a janitor's badge clipped to her jacket. She looked tired, her eyes puffy, her shoulders tight like she hadn't had a good night's sleep in weeks. She sat down without saying much. Maribel brought her a plate and a cup. The woman took a bite, let out a quiet breath, and closed her eyes for a moment longer than usual. That was enough. By 8 a.m., 5 more women had joined her. They didn't come in together, but somehow found the same corner. None of them asked for anything special. Just coffee, space, and time. No one rushed them. No one looked over their shoulder. That first day, we served 23 people. More than I expected. Most stayed longer than they needed to. They ate slowly, talked in low voices. Some didn't talk at all. I didn't sit. I moved between tables, wiping crumbs, refilling mugs. I kept the music low, the lights warm, and the register drawer open wide enough so no one had to fumble. We didn't have uniforms, just aprons with soft pockets and a stitched tag inside that said, "You belong here." By the second week, we had regulars. One of them, a bus driver named Carol, brought a tin of her own cookies. She told us she used to bake every Christmas until her son said she needed to stop wasting money. We put her cookies in a glass jar by the register and labeled them Carol's Special. Each name, each face, stitched something into the air of that place, like the walls were learning who we were. Not as workers, not as mothers, but as full, whole women. Then one morning just before Christmas, Sienna returned. This time she didn't come alone. She brought her mother-in-law, a tall, elegant woman named Vivian. I had seen her once before at a fundraiser. She wore confidence like perfume, subtle but strong. They sat at a booth near the window, ordered espresso, and a split slice of lemon tart. Sienna avoided my eyes. Vivian didn't. She looked around the space like she was measuring something. Then she asked how long we had been open. Lorraine answered politely. Vivian asked if we planned to expand. I said nothing. They didn't stay long. 15 minutes, maybe 20. Just enough for Sienna to notice the small board by the counter listing our mission. She read it in silence. For working women, for healing spaces, for second chances. When they left, Vivian nodded once in my direction. Sienna didn't speak. Later that night, I found the tip they had left, a folded $20 bill and a card, blank inside except for a handwritten line. "You've built something they can't buy." I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I slid it into my notebook between the first sketch and the business license. That night, Maribel and I locked up together. We stood outside for a while, watching the wind carry the last leaves down the street. Her empanadas had sold out again. She smiled and said maybe she'd try her grandmother's soup next. I told her to bring it. No one had to know who had walked through the door that morning. No one had to hear what wasn't said. But I knew, and that was enough. 2 days after Sienna and her mother-in-law visited the diner, the first email arrived. It came through the general contact form on our small website. A polite message, nothing dramatic, just a short line from a local reporter asking if I would be open to a quick interview. She said she had heard about no apologies from a community group and thought it might make for a small piece in the weekend column. I didn't answer right away. I forwarded it to Lorraine, who called me within the hour. She said she had already looked the woman up, legitimate, thoughtful, and not the kind to twist words for drama. So I agreed. The reporter came on a Tuesday morning. She ordered coffee and a scone, sat in the same booth as the first janitor who ever walked through our doors. She asked good questions about the name, about what made me start this now after so many years of silence. I told her it wasn't silence, it was listening to my body, to the years I gave away to the quiet voice that had been pushed down for decades but never quite left. She stayed for an hour, took photos of the space, of Maribel standing by the stove, of Carol's cookies in the glass jar. When she asked to take mine, I said, "Only from behind."
She respected that.
The article came out that Sunday, just a small feature tucked into the back section, but people noticed. The following Monday, we had twice the number of visitors. Some came with cautious eyes, unsure what they were stepping into. Others came as if they already knew, like someone had whispered to them on the bus or passed along a folded flyer at work. No one came for the glamour. They came because the sign in the window promised something different, and we gave it to them. Later that week, I came home to find a letter on my cot at the airport storage closet. I hadn't told anyone I still slept there sometimes. It was quiet, cheap, and it gave me room to think. The letter was in a white envelope, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from Sienna. She said she didn't understand the choices I had made. She said it embarrassed her at first, seeing me behind a counter, seeing my hands busy with flour and my apron stained with jam. But then she said something shifted. Not all at once, just a crack in the surface. She wrote that Vivian had offered to invest in my diner, had suggested helping me open a second location downtown, but that she declined, saying it would ruin the soul of the place, and that maybe, just maybe, I had built something no one else could define. There was no apology, just acknowledgement. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my notebook. Not next to the business plan, but behind the page where I had once written. I was erased today. That page stayed there, but now it had company. That night, Lorraine pulled me aside after close. She said a community organization had reached out, wanting to feature No Apologies as part of a women's leadership initiative, and asked if we would be willing to host a small weekend workshop on basic skills, food prep, financial literacy, and self-care. She waited for my reaction. I said yes, not because I wanted recognition, but because I had space now. I had voice. The following morning, I arrived early and stood outside the diner with a coffee in my hands. The sun was just starting to rise. I watched the light stretch across the sidewalk, catching the words on the glass, "No apologies." And for the first time, I whispered the name aloud. Not for others, for me. The workshop took shape faster than I expected. Lorraine printed flyers. Marble asked her cousin, a nurse, to come speak about basic health rights. Carol offered to teach a simple budgeting method she had used for years when raising 3 kids alone on a single paycheck. Word spread quietly. We didn't need a banner, just a sign taped in the window and a few extra folding chairs. That Saturday, before the first session started, I unlocked the front door just after sunrise. The street was quiet. A light breeze swept across the sidewalk. I stood there for a minute, holding the keys, feeling the cool weight of what we had built. Inside, the diner was already humming. Coffee brewing, butter warming on the skillet, the smell of something alive. By 8 o'clock, 10 women had gathered. By 9, we had to bring in stools from the storage closet. They came with notebooks, plastic grocery bags, sleeping babies, and quiet eyes that scanned the room like they weren't sure they deserved to stay. We fed them first. No one learns on an empty stomach. Then we taught, or rather, we shared. No Apologies didn't become a classroom. It became a mirror for women to hear themselves in someone else's voice. To remember things they hadn't dared say out loud in years. The ones who had been caretakers, who had put their names last, who had forgotten how to ask for something small without first apologizing. At lunch, while everyone chatted over sandwiches and soup, Lorraine pulled me aside. She said there was someone waiting outside, and that she looked uncomfortable. I stepped out and saw Sienna. She wasn't dressed like usual, no silk scarf, no manicured nails. She wore jeans, a plain sweatshirt, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hands were empty. No gifts, no excuses. She didn't ask to come in. She stood by the wall, where we had hung a chalkboard. It read, "This space is for building back what the world tried to tear down." I waited. She finally said she had read the article again, that she had visited the website late at night more than once. She said she hadn't known how to show up, not as a daughter, not as a critic, but as a person. I told her she didn't have to come in, that she didn't owe me anything, and that I didn't know her shame. She nodded, said she understood, then handed me a folded paper. Her handwriting had always been neat. She said she had contacted her lawyer and had reviewed some of the accounts under both our names. Years ago, she had added her name to one of my old retirement accounts. She had meant it as a safeguard, she said. But after reading what she did, she realized she had also used it as leverage. The letter confirmed she had removed herself from it fully. No strings. She had signed it and notarized it. No words of regret, just action. I thanked her, not with a smile, not with tears, just a steady voice. Then I went back inside. The workshop ended just after 3. We handed out little notebooks with the phrase, "You belong," written on the first page. Women hugged each other like they hadn't known they needed it. Marble served the last round of empanadas with a smile so wide it reached her eyes. That night I sat at the last booth by the window, lights low, register closed. I opened the folded letter again and let it rest on the table. Sienna didn't become someone new that day, and I didn't turn into a hero. But the lock she had once turned quietly on my life, she had just opened it, and I wasn't going back. The week after the workshop, things returned to their quiet rhythm. The kind of rhythm that wasn't loud, but steady, the kind you could rest inside. Marble added her grandmother's soup to the lunch menu. Lorraine updated the shift schedule with her usual black pen, precise and even. Carol started showing up 30 minutes early, just to sit by the window with a cup of strong coffee and fold napkins. She said it gave her peace. One night, long after close, I stayed back to organize the supply inventory. The freezer needed cleaning, and I didn't trust anyone else to do it right. I had music playing low on a little radio we kept near the back prep sink. Something about old jazz always helped me think. As I pulled a box of frozen dough from the bottom shelf, I noticed an envelope taped to the side of the fridge. My name was written in ink, crooked and familiar. Lorraine's handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a printed draft, a grant application. She had written it on my behalf for a community revitalization fund. It detailed how No Apologies had become a model space for working-class women, a place of support, of resilience. At the bottom, she had written one line by hand. "This isn't about growing big. It's about growing deep." I folded the paper slowly and placed it on the office shelf next to the flower inventory sheet. I didn't feel pride. I felt steadiness, like the floor under me had grown wider without anyone noticing. 3 days later, Vivian returned. This time, she came alone. She wore navy slacks and a dark wool coat. No jewelry. Her makeup was softer. She sat at the same booth she had before and ordered the empanadas with a side of ginger tea. Lorraine served her and stayed nearby, arms crossed lightly, just watching. Vivian didn't speak right away. She ate slowly, folding her napkin after each bite. Then she called me over with a gentle nod. Her tone was formal but not sharp. She said she had been watching the growth of the diner and quietly admiring the restraint in how it was handled. No advertising, no social media blitz, just word of mouth, just consistency. Then she placed a folder on the table. It was a proposal, a joint initiative she was spearheading, not an investment, not a buyout, but a public funding partnership aimed at creating spaces like ours in other cities. She said she didn't want to replicate No Apologies. That would cheapen it. She wanted to support local versions built by women who had the same fire, the same quiet strength. She said she would understand if I refused, that sometimes dignity means staying small. I didn't answer then. I excused myself, walked to the back office, and sat with a folder unopened on the desk. It was heavier than it looked, not because of the paper, but because of the history it tried to touch. I didn't want more diners. What I wanted was already here. But I also knew this wasn't about expansion. It was about invitation, about saying yes to other women who had been folded small their whole lives. I returned to the front. Vivian had finished her tea. She didn't look expectant, just calm. I told her I would think about it. She nodded. No smile, no hard sell, just understanding. Before she left, she said one more thing. The greatest inheritance is not wealth. It's a space where someone remembers they are allowed to take up room. I stood at the door after she left, staring at the quiet street outside. And I realized something. She had finally seen me. Not as an accessory to her son, not as a burden in the corner of a cramped apartment, but as a woman who built something with both hands after being told she had nothing left. The morning I made the final decision, the sky was overcast and low. I walked to the diner before sunrise. No coat, just a thick sweater and my hands deep in my pockets. The air smelled like wet concrete and old leaves. It had rained the night before, and the sidewalk still held puddles that mirrored the glow of the street lamps. Inside, Marble was already at the stove, stirring her grandmother's soup with quiet focus. Lorraine was by the counter going over supply orders. Nothing in the air said today would be different, but I knew it would be. I pulled out Vivian's folder from the back cabinet, placed it flat on the counter, and looked at it again, slower this time. I had already read it twice, but this time I read the blank spaces, the tone between the lines. It wasn't a takeover. It was an offering, a chance to extend a hand to someone who hadn't yet found the courage to open a door. I didn't say anything to Lorraine or Marble right away. I just worked, refilled the napkin holders, washed out the coffee pots, swept around the baseboards like it mattered. Then I walked to the small bulletin board near the front window and pinned a new note beside the workshop flyers. It read, "Coming soon. Community mentorship series for any woman wondering if her story is still worth telling." That afternoon, I emailed Vivian. I told her I was willing to be part of her initiative, not as a model, not as a brand, but as a guide. I said I would meet with the women she had in mind. I would help them build their own places, their own no apologies, on their own terms. And I told her one more thing. This diner would stay exactly as it was. We would not multiply. We would magnify. That night, Sienna came by unannounced. She wasn't there to talk, just to see. She walked through the space slowly, her fingers grazing the edge of a counter, the rim of a stool. She paused at the chalkboard wall, where guests left notes. Dozens of messages in all kinds of handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me. I didn't know I was allowed to rest. This reminded me of who I used to be." She read every line. Then she turned to me and nodded once. No words, just that. I watched her leave through the glass door. Her reflection faded into the dusk as the street lights flickered on. In the quiet, I stood at the register, my hands resting on the counter. And I thought of all the women who had passed through here, the ones who stayed, the ones who only came once but never forgot. I thought about the silence I used to carry like a weight, the kind of silence that doesn't protect, only suffocates. And I realized somewhere between the first pot of soup and that last folded letter, I had stepped into something else. Not just a diner, not just a second chance, but a life where I no longer had to earn my place at the table. Because now I was the one setting it. I no longer wake up to silence. I wake up to the smell of proofing dough, the clatter of pans, the quiet hum of something being made. The cot at the airport is gone. I gave away the last box of my old life to a woman who needed it more than I did. My address now is the small apartment above the diner. 2 rooms, 1 window, and the soft sound of morning life rising through the floor. On Sundays, I open late. It's the only day we do that. Women from the community come in earlier. Some to help prep, some to simply sit and be. The walls hold stories now. Not mine alone. They breathe with all the voices that have passed through. Lorraine still runs the front, her shoulders straighter these days. Her laugh deeper. Marble soups now rotate by season. Every time she brings in a new pot, she writes a note next to it. Memory of my mother. Taste of the village. Warmth for when you don't know where else to go. Sienna visits every once in a while. She never stays long. Just enough to refill her mug, say a few words, then go.
We don't talk about the past.
We don't talk about what she once said about that cramped studio or what it meant to her when she said it. She knows. I know that is enough. As for Vivian, her initiative is moving forward slowly, carefully. She updates me once a month. I've met 2 women already, one in Detroit and one in Fresno, both bruised but standing, both with their own keys now. The sign in the window remains unchanged.
No hay paleris.
People have asked if we'll ever rebrand, add a logo, make it trend, but the name stays because it wasn't just for the world to read. It was for me to remember every single day. I don't need revenge. I don't need forgiveness wrapped in ribbon. What I needed was to live without shrinking. And now I do. If you've ever been made to feel small in your own story, I hope this gave you a little room to breathe. If it reminded you of something you buried long ago, I hope it stirred gently, not with pain, but with possibility. And if you're standing at the edge of a new beginning, unsure, I just want to say this. You don't need permission to take up space. You never did. And if this story meant something to you, even just a little, I'd love to know.